At issue this Sunday morning, will Beacon Hill be audited? Diana DiZoglio hopes so, following ballot question 1's successful passage. We'll speak with the state auditor about the expanded power she's been granted and what she plans to do with it.
Plus, we'll sit down with the state's former education secretary and hear his concerns for students and schools now that the requirement to pass the MCAS has been repealed. At issue starts right now.
Good Sunday morning and welcome to another edition of At Issue. Thanks for joining us. I'm Matt Pritchard.
And I'm Sue O'Connell. We have the state auditor standing by and we have lots of questions for her.
Yes, indeed. But before we get to all of that, let's take a look back at what was at issue this week, starting with President-elect Donald Trump's cabinet.
We go now to the transition to Trump. The president-elect has announced another administration pick. He has tapped Dr. Mehmet Oz to serve as the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services administrator.
Well, some breaking news tonight. President-elect Donald Trump names Linda McMahon as his pick to lead the education department.
And a New Hampshire native has been tapped to serve as the next White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt.
All right, breaking at 4, former Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz has withdrawn from consideration for Attorney General.
The controversial former representative was drawing raised eyebrows from senators on both sides of the aisle.
Mayor Michelle Wu is defending her proposal to raise commercial tax rates in Boston.
We need residents to have enough money in their pockets at the end of every month to be able to go out and support our businesses.
Governor Maura Healey signed a new law that will help make breast cancer screenings more equitable. Starting in 2026, the legislation requires insurers to cover diagnostic exams for breast cancer.
Governor Maura Healey has signed a new law advancing clean energy in the Commonwealth. The bill includes provisions to lower energy costs, including discounts for middle-class households on heat pumps and electric cars.
The 2024 NBA champs with a celebration on the South Lawn.
No matter the sport, what these champions all have in common are core values.
And while all that was taking place, we also have a bitter battle over auditing the state legislature.
Beacon Hill isn't exactly a beacon of transparency. You pay taxes, maybe, but you probably don't know exactly where those tax dollars are going.
Yeah, time and time again, those pushing for greater access have said our legislature is among the least transparent in the country, but that may soon change. Voters approved a ballot measure that could grant the state auditor a deeper look into the daily goings-on of the State House. Auditors have long held authority over departments, offices, commissions, institutions, and activities of the Commonwealth, but not the legislature itself. Question 1 explicitly adds the legislature to that list.
Leadership on Beacon Hill? Well, they don't like this. They've been vehemently opposed to the efforts and have so far refused to work with the auditor's office. Diana DiZoglio was elected state auditor in 2022, and her successful campaign was built on the promise that, if elected, she would audit the legislature. Just 2 years later, DiZoglio seemingly has the power to do so.
She's joining us this morning to talk about what she has planned. Thanks so much for joining us. Sure appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me back on the show.
So let's talk about ballot question 1. I mean, voters approved this. We've talked a little bit about the language, but it seems like there's still some uncertainty here. So why is that?
First and foremost, I want to say thank you to everybody at home who voted for question 1. This passed by nearly 72% of the vote. That is incredible. So thank you to everybody who voted for this, supported this, collected the signature for this. It is incredibly unfortunate that we're already starting to see pushback from legislative leaders in particular, and the House of Representatives, actually, who took a vote just recently to essentially stymie the will of the voters and instead continue to conduct their audits through a private vendor whom they can control what they audit, what they give them access to, and what they present to the general public, skirting around the public records law, skirting around the new audit law. And we have a lot of work to do to make sure that legislators are held to the same standards as everybody else as the new law intended.
So the legislative leaders, they, as you note, often say, look, we are audited by this independent third-party agency. Speaker Ron Mariano and the House voted to allow you to pick that outside group. Let's take a listen to them presenting this on the floor.
While we await the certification of the ballot initiative, the House is taking steps today to affirm our commitment to our constituents. With this proposed rules change, we seek to ensure that any audit pursuant to the passage of question 1 will be a professional audit, not a political one.
So a twofold question here. Why, in your mind, does the third-party process fall short? And does this, everything that they're presenting, line up with the language that ballot question 1 laid out?
Yeah, I think it's important to say that the representative you just saw speaking on the floor has not supported our efforts to audit. The legislature has not come out and said that she supports question 1 and its implementation. So this very much was intentionally put up on the House floor to undermine the will of the voters. So that's number 1. Number 2, look, a private vendor, the private vendor they have now, we had no issues with the private vendor that conducts their audits currently. They're a professional auditing firm. The issue that we had with that occurring is that the Speaker and the Senate President can control every aspect of the scope of that audit. They can deny that audit firm access to state contracts, procurement procedures. That auditing firm has no authority to subpoena documents, if need be, that are requested. So a lot can be hidden. They decide what they release to the general public, what's examined, what's not examined. So essentially, nothing changes under what they just voted for, except for the fact that they're saying, well, you know, we're going to give the auditor a little bit more of the ability to supposedly participate in this process. But it was disingenuous, friends, because the Speaker of the House said, you know, this was to ensure that we were all working together and that he was intent on working together with our office. That's the same Speaker who's been parking behind me for 2 years at the State House and has not even said so much as a hello to me. So, you know, with all due respect, this was to undermine the will of the voters. They have no intention of working together with our office. And I remind the legislature, this is not a disagreement with the Office of State Auditor anymore. This is what the voters voted for, and it is now law. So I'm calling on the legislature to follow the law.
Is it surprising, though? I mean, the way that each ballot question, what happens after it's voted, if it's approved, depending on what it is asking to do, it has a process it goes through. This is the process, though, for this type of question. It's passed into law. You have your 30 days. The state lawmakers get to make adjustments to it or not, and the governor gets to sign it or not. So it's not surprising that this is the process. That part's correct, right?
So, yeah, there is a process that the legislature gets to go through. We kept this ballot question incredibly simple for this very reason. I served in the legislature, and when, you know, these ballot questions come before the legislative body, if they are incredibly technical, if they are incredibly detailed, you know, the legislature needs to read through. They need to see, you know, what they believe is good, not so good, what they believe, you know, they might need to examine and talk to their constituents about. This was very, very plainly laid out. It was a one-liner, and all it did was add the legislature to the current language of the law without changing that law at all regarding how audits are done or the standards that we're required to follow. So this just adds the legislature to the long list of what we already audit. There should be no changes to question 1. We are calling on the legislature and the governor and the Attorney General's office to speak out and support this in its entirety.
Whenever people move to Massachusetts, Matt moved to Massachusetts, Corey Smith, our co-host, moved to Massachusetts, they are always so shocked, first of all, that we have this overwhelmingly same-party state house with usually, if it's a Republican governor, they're a moderate, you know, Massachusetts Republican governor, and all the Democrats, yet things don't seem to get done as quickly as they would expect. And also, the transparency, we're not making it up. We are probably last in the nation when it comes to transparency. And most elected officials make some sort of pledge that they're going to increase the transparency and then find ways to not do that. Why is this issue important to you? Why you, as a Democrat, get elected and then get elected to a state office, and you take on this battle that so many other people have just said, nope, this is just the way it is. Why is this important to you?
Look, when I was campaigning for state auditor, I heard the trepidation in people's voices in, you know, making their decision on whether or not they wanted to appoint me to state auditor, because I had served in the legislature for 10 years. I myself was a state representative for 6 years. I was then a state senator for 4 years. So when I ran for the office of state auditor, the question I got most from tax-paying voters across our communities was, are you, as a former
relationship between you and many in legislative leadership, how do you balance, I guess, trying to improve that while simultaneously trying to take on this mandate you feel you have?
You know, I don't, you know, when we talk about these different issues on Beacon Hill, one issue isn't reflective of another issue. For example, Governor Healy was just in my hometown of Methuen just a few days ago, and I was incredibly grateful to our governor for coming to my hometown to take a tour of the youth center project that I've been working on since I was a kid. It's one of my passion projects, so to speak. She came out, she offered assistance, she asked how she could be helpful. We then went together to a Chamber of Commerce event and talked about how we're working on, you know, economic development initiatives together and how our offices partner together, because we very much do partner together. That doesn't mean that we're always on the same page about everything. I've also been very clear that I do think that the executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch should all be subject to the public records law. That's a separate issue than the youth center project or than the economic development legislation that was just worked on. So, you know, it's important that, you know, we all act in line with what our jobs call us to do, and that is to make sure that we're working across party lines, working across our agencies, working together with legislators who want to work together with us. And, you know, there are a host of other issues that we get to work together on that we very much should work together on and do work together on. That doesn't mean that there are no disagreements. And unfortunately, this is one of those areas where there are very strong disagreements and where I've called on the governor, the attorney general, and the legislature to respect the will of the voters on question 1. And please demonstrate that support publicly, because I can't do this without them.
We'll be watching your efforts closely. Massachusetts Auditor Diana DiZoglio, thanks for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Appreciate it. Well, a seismic change for schools across the Commonwealth.
The MCAS requirement is no more. But what comes next? That still needs to be filled in.
Still to come, we'll sit down with a state lawmaker who's got some new standards in mind, and the state's former Secretary of Education, now teaching at Harvard, who pushed hard to keep MCAS in place. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to At Issue. A big change is coming to schools all across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Passing the MCAS exam will no longer be a requirement to earn a high school diploma.
That's right. Question 2, which advanced with a hard push by the Massachusetts Teachers Association, was approved by voters with 59% circling yes on their ballots. That decision effectively ends a roughly 20-year policy which required public school students to pass the exam in order to graduate. Now, the general argument for keeping it in place centered on upholding statewide education standards, while the other side argued the test doesn't properly measure students' abilities. Here to discuss the outcome and what comes next is Paul Revel, a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and State Senator Jason Lewis from the 5th Middlesex District. Thanks both of you for being here. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
All right, Paul, the horse is out of the barn. Here we are going forward. Senator Lewis has laid out some ideas, which we'll get to in just a little bit, about replacing it. But what should we be concerned about? What are some factors that we should be taking into account as we move forward here?
Well, right off the bat, the value, the credibility, the prestige of a Massachusetts high school diploma has plummeted radically. And that should be disturbing to everybody in the Commonwealth. The diploma no longer represents a certain level of skill and knowledge that people, that students have when they graduate, that might inform employers and college admissions officers as to what they can do. So I think there's an urgent need to restore the credibility of the Massachusetts high school diploma, and we can talk about how you do that and as we go on in our conversation.
Yeah. I mean, Senator, do you feel that it is that drastic, the impact of removing the MCAS graduation requirement?
Well, what I said back in September when I publicly endorsed question 2 was that I did think we should be moving away from just using a standardized test to determine whether a student should graduate high school in our state, but we should replace that with an alternative statewide standard that would be uniform, that would be rigorous, and we would still make sure that we, as Secretary Revel says, we maintain high standards, and we want to make sure we continue to have excellent public schools for all students in Massachusetts.
So, Paul, if you're on a school district of one of the 300-plus school districts across the state, should people be the people who are in charge of the schools be coming up with some sort of requirement to pass? Should they be waiting to see what the legislature does?
Well, I mean, we already have. We have a decentralized system of education. We already have graduation standards in local communities. In fact, before there was an MCAS, there were just local graduation requirements. One of the things that, that distinguishes Massachusetts is we have very, very lean state requirements for graduation. It's 1 year of history and civics education and 4 years of physical education. So that's minimal. So adding the MCAS was a really important installation of a rigorous kind of high standard, but it was a medium high standard, let's put it that way. It was a 10th grade standard, and some argue that it's actually an 8th or 9th grade standard. But at any rate, we installed a standard that said, irrespective of the district that you attended, school, and whatever their standards would be, and we know they vary widely, and this is a big challenge that MCAS was designed to meet, which is to establish, as the senator said, a common standard that irrespective of where you're going to school, in what district, in what particular school, there's a common instrument. Think of it as a thermometer or a yardstick that would be the same for everybody and would tell us how students in that district, in that school, in that classroom were doing. And then we could use that for diagnostic purposes to improve the performance of the individual, to improve school performance, to improve the performance of subgroups. And having that kind of indicator was really important. And having it count meant that high school students would take it seriously and work on it. I mean, one of the things that happens if MCAS no longer counts for high school graduation is students have no motivation by the time they get to 10th grade to take and try hard on a test that, for which there's no accountability measure. So I worry about that in terms of whatever we put in its place in the future.
Senator, I know in recent months prior to this ballot question even coming forward, there were conversations in the legislature about changing out MCAS for something different statewide. So what were those conversations, and are they going to play a role as we move forward?
That's right. We weren't waiting for this decision around the ballot question. The conversations already had begun in the legislature with the Healy administration, with the leadership of the unions and other stakeholders. And, as Paul said, Massachusetts is unusual among states in not having certain course requirements. And this, I think, gives us an opportunity to actually set out the courses and other, academic requirements that we expect, every student to have completed, courses they should have passed before they graduate high school. So there is something called Mass Core, which has existed for almost 2 decades. It's been recommended that all students complete Mass Core to be prepared for college and career. There's a lot of evidence that shows that students who complete it do better after high school, but it's not required. And in many other states, that set of courses is required. So it's what you would expect: 4 years of English, 4 years of math, certain number of years of science with a lab, social studies, arts. So one of the things we're talking about is, could we require something like Mass Core that all districts need to make sure they can provide students with those courses and students can take and pass those courses. There's some details to work out, but I think that's a great starting place, hopefully, for this conversation.
So, Senator, we are consistently in Massachusetts, survey after survey, rated at the very top, number 1, number 3, top 5 at the lowest when it comes to the quality K through 12 education that our public school students get. If there suddenly is a drop in that, if that quality starts to go quickly and we don't have something that's going to replace the MCAS statewide, should we hit the panic button? What should happen?
Yeah, I don't think we need to panic. We are very proud of our schools, but there's a long way still to go. Our test scores, because we will still have the benefit of MCAS and scores, and also on national scores, national tests like the NAEP, which is the Nation's Report Card, our scores have actually been very flat for a long time. So, and we also have very big gaps between different student groups, high-income students, low-income students, students of color versus white students. So, we still know that we can't be complacent, and we've got a lot of work to do. And I personally see this as an opportunity to re-examine, what we want the high school experience to be for our students. There's an opportunity to make the high school experience more engaging for students, more real-world experiences. Those are some of the things I think we can take into consideration when we decide what the new graduation standard should be.
Paul, a couple that I want you to respond to there is not only is Mass Core enough to fill the role that the MCAS used to fill, and do you anticipate any sort of drop in our standards in the years ahead?
Well, first of all, Senator Lewis and I participated in a number of conversations over the years and have been allied and aligned on a lot of topics, even though we voted differently on this particular question. So I appreciate the kind of thoughtful leadership he brings to it. When I was Secretary of Education for Deval Patrick, I voted for the Common Core, and I was a strong proponent of the Common Core, and have pushed in recent years for making that Common Core more available than it currently is to students. It's voluntary, as the Senator has suggested, and we should require it. However, the problem that MCAS was designed to fix was the variability in content and standards, no matter what the course. So we know that we can prescribe these courses and we can measure seat time, that is, who took the course, who passed, but we have no real reading as to what qualified a passing performance in one place versus another place. In fact, as some researchers have looked at what's going on in Mass Core classes, there's just extremely wide variability. The same kind of variability that I talked about earlier with respect to district standards. So it still doesn't solve the problem of getting to a common standard that everybody has had to get measured against and is made public and is used for diagnostic purposes. So I do worry, Matt, that there will be a decline in standards if we revert to what we had before MCAS, which was, we had statewide testing, by the way. It didn't count. There were no consequences to it. It was what we call norm reference tests, so it compared you to others, so you'd find out that people in an affluent suburb were in the 98th percentile, and people in a poor urban community were in the 5th percentile, and people would shrug their shoulders and go on about their business. MCAS, after all, testing, after all, is a measurement instrument. It's a tool for discerning who's making progress, who isn't, who's met the standard, who hasn't. But it's not a strategy. So I agree with the Senator that, for example, we need to do a lot to improve the quality of high school education in Massachusetts, and the way in which students in high schools within their district present for evaluation. I think performance tasks, I think portfolios, and some of the things that have been suggested that I don't think fit very well as a state standard for measuring performance, but would do well in a local context. We ought to try those things. But we have to recognize that when we measure standards, if we rely completely on local judgment, there's a conflict of interest there. Because as we look at these test scores, it's in your interest as a classroom teacher or as a school leader or as a district leader to show the best possible performance in your district. And so it's not that teacher judgment isn't important. Obviously, it's primarily important in terms of how students advance. But we need some other indicator, particularly as the state pays a lot of the bills for education in Massachusetts. We need another indicator to make sure that we've got some common standard that employers and college admissions officers can expect.
Can I make a quick question? Yeah, very briefly. So just wanted to point out, make sure folks know, we do have curriculum frameworks that are established. So in all subjects and all grade levels, there is direction given to our teachers in terms of what the material they should be covering. So I think that's important to note. That didn't used to be in place decades ago. Second thing is, I do agree that we need to look for mechanisms to ensure that when a student's taking Algebra 1 at one high school, that is comparable in rigor to Algebra 1 in another high school. So we are discussing ways that we can accomplish that. Could we have some kind of review or auditing process, for example, ways to ensure that that kind of rigor is consistent and equitable for all students?
Well, this is a conversation. We are, of course, going to be tracking. Both of you, I know, will be involved in it. So we appreciate you both coming in today and explaining it for our viewers. Thanks.
Thanks to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Appreciate it. Well, that's it for this edition of At Issue. Join us next Sunday as we get personal with the state legislature. We are talking to some longtime lawmakers who are leaving and some newcomers just elected to Beacon Hill. Thanks for joining us. I'm Matt Pritchard.
And I'm Sue O'Connell. Have a great day.